if I look at today, the present situation index is significantly higher than the expectations index of what is to come. When you back up in time in uncertain times, the very beginning of the pandemic, the present situation index was lower than the expectations index of what was to come.
And it was just a fascinating interview. And what I'm finding is that a lot of the people in the administration are not long-term politicians, but are coming from a business background, Jeff. Episode 36, two uninteresting guys talking about interesting times, Jeff. We have interest rates. We have inventory up. We have consumer confidence down. What a world we're looking at here the rest of 2025. What do you make of it?
I can't disagree with that at all, although I think you may have just found the tagline for the podcast of two uninteresting guys talking about interesting things. I mean, we're very interested in what in the heck is going on out there in markets and in the economy and the world around us, but I don't know that I would sit down and listen to us in terms of interest level. But there's no shortage of things to be paying attention to and headlines, taking place. So it's fun as always to be diving into these things.
Yeah, Jeff, as we sit down to record today, you and I it's hard to find weekly time to sit down and record, and feels like it's getting a little harder over the last month or two. Just there's movement one way or another. I think we see that, you kind of feel that around the country, and movement isn't all good. Believe me, it's just movement. It's not the stagnant state that we've been in for a couple of years. And so hard to find time to do it. Glad we are. And hopefully that is a sign of change coming.
I think it is, and you and I were on a conversation with Brian Reynolds for a minute. Shout out to him, does a great job on his Appraiser Update podcast. But as we were talking about what we were doing with our humble effort to kick this podcast off, he didn't even have to say anything. I just read in his body language when we said we were aspiring to put something out weekly, of him saying, good luck with that. That's one heck of a lift. And I interpreted that correctly. It certainly has been. It's one of those things, that you really enjoy doing, but is not convenient to do. But it sure forces us to be paying attention to what's going on out there and trying to interpret it better than, you might otherwise if it was just head down, not paying attention to a lot of these big macro swings and trends and topics that are taking place out there.
Boy, you bet. And, we've got yet another article dissecting here to kick us off about high inventory and growing inventory, specifically in the new construction space. What do you see as you're looking at that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm happy to share a screen for those that are viewing. At least I'm assuming this is what you're thinking of initially, Mark, where this was a really interesting analysis that was brought by John Burns. I think you found this, Mark. I don't know if you have any context around the source on this data, other than that it's sales and incentives from Lennar purchases dating back to the first quarter of 2009.
Yeah. So this is all sort of adding together here. We've got from Lennar's kind of quarterly earnings. They didn't always report this for whatever reason in 2020, but this is a percentage of the sale price they were offering in concessions, and you can see that just in 2022, that averaged 1.5%, and Q1 of this year, it's at 13%. We've been talking a lot about that, but boy, these are big numbers of purchase prices. And this is putting pressure on builders, still turning a lot of profit. There's a lot of room with increasing prices that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, but having to do a lot more to close these sales for sure. And why is this growing so much? Which comes first? I think it is, if we go to the next slide, Jeff, it is this new construction single family inventory that is really showing a sharp increase over the last 6 to 12 months. And the first graph here on the left is just the completed sales. which is a sharp rise, not nearing the outrageous levels leading into the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis. But when we look over to the right, we see that all stages of construction, they are not stopping building. Builders have a lot of inventory. They are paying a lot to close homes, but that has not been any sign to stop what they're doing or slow down what they're doing, the best I can tell.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what's then reflected in the, the prior chart. They're having to, because inventory levels are increasing, they're having to increase incentives to try to get that inventory moved. And in fact, I'm going to jump back real quick because it was interesting just to look at the level of where the incentives are, that it rose up to 13% in this first quarter of 2025, which is higher than it's been since about 2010, if I'm seeing this right. Kind of coming out of, but in the great financial crisis. And in 2004, 5, and 6, you had a lot of speculative inventory that was brought onto the market, and then that's what's reflected in that big spike on this chart in the left. That since recovered and is now, been working its way up. But I think the builder incentives reflect their motivation to move inventory. And, we've talked previously about some of those incentives being rate buy downs, which are a less expensive way for them to help buyers afford and get into homes than just overall price reductions. But it's all kind of telling that same story that, we're starting to approach back to incentive levels and even inventory levels that we haven't seen in well over a decade.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And this is a trend that we've been seeing. And, this particular article from Wolf Street is showing charts like this in different segments. So what we're looking at here is national. There were a lot more charts that I won't bore you all with, that are showing different segments of the United States, the Northeast, the South, the West, and Midwest, and so on. And what you'll find is a lot of the charts look a lot like this, a big peak in 2009, a dip, and then a pretty sharp increase here over the last 12 months. But we spent a lot of time talking about this, I think, on the last episode, which is the Northeast just operating different than the rest of the country, for sure.
Yeah, that's the fascinating thing, is it's so easy to just assume that, hey, the market's doing something and it's doing the same thing across the country, regardless of where you live. And that just turns out really not to be the case. It is geographically specific, but at some level, the trend throughout most of the country, with maybe the Northeast being the exception in the moment, is for this rising inventory level. And, I don't think that's translated into material price reductions across the board, but I'm starting to see more kind of anecdotal evidence of prices starting to soften at some level. And as much as anything, the psychology of the market staying stable versus the psychology of prices are going down, really, once that mental shift changes in real estate agents' minds and prospective buyer and sellers' minds, is where I think you really start to see the trend, or the change in the trend line, make a significant change from what it historically has been.
Well, as real estate professionals and appraisers, you and I mean, this is what we've been sitting here saying that we need to see happen for 2 years. Is we need to see inventory increase, and we really, sadly, need to see consumer confidence and ultimate spending come down, Jeff. And, I have traveled around the country in 2024, and, maybe I happen to be in Las Vegas for a conference, or just flying somewhere, and just amazed at how busy everything is, packed to the gild everywhere I go. While we're sitting here saying, hey, there's some tough medicine that we think needs to be taken nationally in order for the housing market to turn a bit, and just not seeing it happen. And I can say that I think we are seeing it happen. And there's a couple of surveys that are often followed to gauge consumer sentiment that show a pretty drastic drop here early in 2025. Those two are the University of Michigan's index of consumer sentiment, as well as the boards. I think it is it just the board, Jeff?
The conference board, yeah, just recently dropped it. Yeah, theirs as well.
Yeah, so maybe if you could run us through a couple of those.
Yeah, you bet. So on the screen for those that are viewing have got this is from the University of Michigan, their index of consumer sentiment. The conference boards is titled similar, but a little different. So we'll see if I'm smart enough to get those right and keep them differentiated. But for the University of Michigan's sentiment index here, they've basically what it was showing is a pretty material drop and fairly recently. So when they look at the month over month change in consumers' sentiment around the market, there was a 10.5% decrease from February to March in their survey of 2025, and a year over year change from March of 25 to March of 24 of negative 27.1%. Expectations for consumers or their sentiment, in the market, you can see that there on this chart here on the left, there have been some real significant like drop points. One in the 70s, one in the 80s. Great financial crisis time of 2009 through 11 or 12, pretty big dip. Is the pandemic first set on, a really big dip, but it's peaked and has started to retreat now in 2025, and pretty consistent, I think, between these two different surveys. Any commentary you have on this one, Mark, before I jump over to the conference board one?
No, I think you covered it.
All right. Belabored it, maybe. So summary there of what they are. So the conference board, they had two charts that were kind of interesting. I grabbed off of their website. This is basically their consumer confidence index, which is what they call theirs. Which you can see, starting in 2025, a real sharp drop from where it was, not down to where it was in pandemic time levels. Bear in mind, this scale goes back through 2007, where the prior one was, back into the 60s or 70s. But what looks to maybe be the start of a trend down, fairly low here. There's one that was really interesting that they've also got on their side. I wanted to just share and talk through for a second. So the other index that they've shared is the present situation index charted against the expectations index over the same time period from 2007 to the present. And what struck me, Mark, was it was just interesting how, if I look at today, the present situation index is significantly higher than the expectations index of what is to come. When you back up in time in uncertain times, the very beginning of the pandemic, the present situation index was lower than the expectations index of what was to come. And we saw that same trend, kind of coming out of the financial crisis of, 2010, 11, 12. You had people feeling like their current situation was worse than it was going to be. Interesting to see how these have evolved over the last, almost 20 years.
For sure, Jeff. And over the last 2 years, coming out of COVID, the consumer confidence and expectations has just been unshakable. Unshakable in the face of rampant inflation, in the face of historically high interest rate hikes that have happened here. Pretty amazing to watch. And, inflation, as it does, reflects itself in entertainment, the cost of concert prices or sporting event prices, the cost of eggs that's been talked a lot about over the last several months. But everything, just going to the grocery store, has gone up a lot. But yet you see very little concern. We've been trying to find little signs of it, maybe in a Starbucks quarterly earnings report or a McDonald's store closures or something. But those things were really not predictive last year, as we were pointing them out, surprisingly. But this certainly reads different. I don't know how you don't tie it back to the actions being taken from this administration. I mean, it all seems to be tied back to that, Jeff. I was just checking in on the U.S. debt clock and the Doge savings meter that we've showed a bit on this podcast. It is now $250 billion. And those in large part are canceled contracts. Well, canceled contracts are probably workers, in a contractor that is serving the government, or in government layoffs, which are usually have very good severance packages that come with it, but mean a job loss and uncertainty with where folks go. So you've just got a lot of change out there. And, as we talked about last week, this administration sort of looks at any interviewer that says, hey, it's starting to get painful out there. What do you think about that? And they just look deadpanned into the camera and say, that is the plan. It'll be short term, but it'll get things right. We'll see.
That's exactly right. And we're seeing other data points too, I think. And I'm seeing earnings guidance from retailers like Walmart and Target. Airline, future earnings guidance is down, and that's impacted their stock price. In fact, as we were talking, I looked up Lennar's stock price, and it was down from the 170s to like the 110 range, over the course of the last 6 months or something on that order. And I think most of the big, building retailers are. And I think that what's happening with those stock pricing, with that stock price change, is the expectation of softer profitability, softer revenue, all, stemming from and the result of weakness in the consumer. And people have been calling for years and years and years, like the recession that was just right around the corner that never got here. And, I'm wondering if these data points start to look a little bit more concrete as far as signaling, softness and potentially a recession, for all of the reasons you just laid out, plus, the others. I don't know that I'm any good at being in the business of predicting the future, but it certainly there, data points now are suggesting a significant change over what things have been coming through the pandemic and a lot of the stimulus that was, pumped into the market and the economy to try to offset, the impact of the nosedive that started in the first quarter of 2020.
You bet. In the conference board's survey, some notes that were coming from that is that the short-term expectations for income, business, and job market. So it fell 10 points to 65.2, the lowest reading in 12 years, but 65.2 is the metric. And it falls well below the threshold of 80, which is a signal of a potential recession in the near future. It'll be really interesting to see how this plays out, because I do think that there are certain stimulus on the way, probably more natural effects that could come. The Fed signaled a couple interest rate drops. Now that may not be, the next time they meet next month, but those are on the horizon. And I don't know how quick deregulation and some of these other things might be able to hit, but there's things to watch that can help. And I have a hard time reading what tariffs do. Obvious increase immediately to those buying goods made overseas or imported. There's an obvious increase there, but these folks that might have lost a job here from the government, related, should be able to see a little hotter job market maybe if these tariffs do actually stick.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you make, because the labor market has been strong and robust. We've seen unemployment tick up marginally, but not significantly, and so it's not that there isn't a relatively robust job market, at least according to the data that's out there. Now that could change, and you may start seeing it spike, but that's just not something we're seeing in the data yet.
Well, all of this, there is just no doubt that the lack of confidence from the consumer or the pessimism that has taken hold is a result of deliberate actions over the first 2.5 months now, almost 3 months of this administration. And I have to say that as a fan of entrepreneurialism and business, the cabinet members, you and I are big fans of the All In podcast. If you've never heard of it, we would certainly recommend listening. You may no longer need to listen to what Jeff and I say here, because it is often the foundation of what we our outlook on things or what we're exposed to. But they just had a couple of atypical interviews visiting the White House with Scott Bessent, who we've talked about. I think we may have talked about the beginnings of that interview when you and I met for this podcast last week. But an hour and a half with Howard Lutnick, who is the Commerce Secretary. I've never known of a Commerce Secretary in my life. Just don't really pay attention to that role. Maybe I should have, but haven't. and didn't know anything about Howard. And it was just a fascinating interview. And what I'm finding is that a lot of the people in the administration are not long-term politicians, but are coming from a business background, Jeff. Howard describes how they are helping fill the cabinet of this administration with really good communicators, almost above all else. And then you hear folks in and around say, man, it's pretty thrilling to give up the pursuit of wealth in transitioning to a pursuit of purpose, trying to help this country kind of get back on track as it relates to spending and our budget deficits.
That's exactly right. And as with anything political, you'll have people that are positive and people that are negative against about those that are put in the cabinet positions and those sorts of things. But one of the things that I've really, through doing this podcast and even just kind of being a consumer of news generally, that I try to do is to get down to the source of the information as best you can. And so these direct interviews with the actual cabinet members give insight into how they present themselves, what their primary focus is. It's been really interesting to just see a longer form content, kind of a conversation with them to see how they think about the world and their role within it, whether treasury or commerce or whatever. And I find that to be so much more, it's more challenging on the one hand, but it's way more enlightening than just what some commentator said about their perspective or some 30-second news clip from what they said, taken out of a 10-minute conversation that they might have had. It's laborious, frankly, like listening to a whole bunch of long form content, but you and I are maybe deranged enough to enjoy it generally, and so the insights that you glean really are more authentic and at the source than just what somebody else told me to think about this particular individual in the role or whatnot. And that was a pretty consistent theme that I've heard between both of those two individuals as well as others. David Sachs is one of the original All In podcast members, and he's in. It still kind of strikes me a little weird that we use the term czar for something, like in in our government. Whatever it is what it is. But but I've heard him express the same sentiment that you were just commenting on, Mark, of not a desire to be trying to enrich themselves, through the service in the government, but a desire to try to help improve things from where they are, because they view the current status quo as, if not an existential risk, at least, deeply concerning about the trajectory. And, and he's commented specifically that I could be out in the market, like building my wealth, which is already, significant, but I'm here focused on something different. And, he talked about having eliminated his personal positions in investments and stuff to avoid conflicts of interest and even the perception of conflicts of interest. And, I understand on the one hand some skepticism around lifelong politicians who are poor going in and rich coming out 30 years later of service in the government. And, that's not what this is. And that's not to say that, any individual may not have their flaws, but I think that if you, at least watch their actions coupled with their stated intents, it's a desire to serve in a public setting for a defined amount of time, which really aligns with what founding fathers did in the first place. And I hope, is really with the intent to, to serve the country and the public as opposed to just individuals. But it seems like that really is the intention with these guys that are there.
This cabinet feels unique in that way, that it is folks coming from a business background, not a career politician sort of background or legal background. And it's exciting. And I there will be a time, I'm sure soon, where a Democrat candidate is in that seat and putting together a cabinet. And I hope that this trend can stay, no matter who is in the presidential seat. So it's just really cool to see, and it feels like real progress is being made on a number of accounts. So progress is what I want for my kids and ultimate grandkids one day is a healthy budget where we don't have $37 trillion of debt growing by trillions every 30 days or whatever it is. We got to get that stuff under wraps. And so who would have thought that we actually could be taking steps to do that? So in that way, I'm really excited, Jeff. And I think part of it is a transition. They are clear. They're such good communicators Besant, Lutnick and all, is like, hey, here is how we're going about it. It's a pretty clearly laid plan. And these things are going to happen, and it's not all positive as the switchover happens. But there's a lot of talk. I hope it happens about some tax relief for middle class, lower middle class. So hopefully that stuff can take place.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, it'll continue to evolve. It always does. But it's just interesting to see the material change. And who would have thought that the richest man in the world, Elon, would have a role in government, like you say. I think to kind of close that out from my perspective, your point of finding a way to incentivize the best and the brightest to come in and serve for service like motivated incentives is inspiring. I mean, I may be naive a little bit on my part too, but it's inspiring. I'm hopeful that that good change and positive effects can come out of it, because it seems like for a long time there just hasn't been hardly any discussion or like serious discussion around government debts and deficits and what do we actually do to really stem the tide. It's just spend more and we'll worry about it later seems to have been the de facto policy for a decade or two. And so to see a significant changing there is reason for hope, I think.
Jeff, I think at the core here, we're really talking about the desire or willingness to serve, and and this has not been always what the politicians that we have in office are. They're not leaving something to go. This is their career that's coming up. But listening to the Prime Minister of India's interview that we talked about a little bit ago, he was telling a story of he took kind of a sabbatical and went off into the mountains and met with yogis and whatever. And it's just sort of trying to find himself and say, man, I really feel called to help people and to do this sort of thing. And the yogi's response was, what the hell are you doing here? I agree with you, but you aren't serving anybody but yourself in this self-exploration. Go out there and serve the world. I thought that was kind of interesting way to do it. So hopefully this is a momentum swing of people that are serving our country.
Yeah, absolutely. And he really was an inspiring type of a leader. It was a fun interview to listen to that he did with Lex Friedman. But I got that same mentality from him of a service-oriented, desire for being there in the first place, and a willingness to try to serve others. And he comes from these humble backgrounds and finds himself, prime minister of the biggest, the most populous country in the world, and still, at least in the podcast, came across as a pretty down to earth type of an individual.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, if you'll allow me to switch gears, I missed this update on LinkedIn from Appraisal Institute President Paula Konikoff, and PAREA, something near and dear to this podcast heart. This is how we started the podcast. For those that are new to listening and maybe weren't here in the beginning, the first 9 or 10 episodes, we're covering this oddly acronymed program called PAREA, Practical Applications of Real Estate Appraisal. I think it's taken me 36 episodes, Jeff, but I think I've got that down now. But to become an appraiser, you have to get experience, and it's a lot of experience, 1,500 hours in many cases, some more, some less, depending on the state you're in and the license you're going for. But to get that experience, traditionally, you have to have a supervising appraiser that has been appraising for more than 3 years be your supervisor. You got to register with the state. You got to sign off on all of their work and work together. And this has made it traditionally very difficult for new people to get into the business. And so PAREA is a program to kind of provide that experience through an academic setting, an online academic setting. And the Appraisal Institute was the first and still so far the only to step up and provide this curriculum through the Appraisal Foundation's kind of new pathway. So we've been big fans of it because we don't view the appraisal profession, or maybe I shouldn't speak for you, Jeff. I don't view the appraisal profession as some walled garden, and it is the existing folks' desire, whether to help new people in or not, be the only way to get into the business. It doesn't feel right to me, and it just needs to be easier. And we've talked about talking to people that have been looking for 12 months and saving full year salary to go work for somebody for free, just to convince them to let them work for free. And so PAREA is here to hopefully provide this extra or additional pathway to becoming an appraiser. We're excited about that. And so Paula has been putting these nice updates. I thought they're nice. I used to serve on the Appraisal Institute board, Jeff. I no longer do. I rolled off this year, so I am reading all these posts just as everybody would. But so an update on PAREA, I think addressing rumors that there was a $1 million loss annually. She said that's not true. They're decreasing losses and heading towards surplus. They've graduated 20. This was about 30 days ago now, but 20 graduates. They have 153 participating students in the program, 67 more ready to go. And they've got 1.22 million scholarships from the Appraisal Foundation and Appraisal Institute Relief Foundation to help cover fees. They've increased the cost of the program, which we were calling for as we were kind of focused on this at the beginning of our podcast. And I guess suffice to say that they do see a path towards making money and repaying the costs necessary to build the program. So I just kind of wanted to provide an update on that, Jeff. If we can talk about the program and what we've seen and updates, but I thought it was useful to provide the listeners.
Yeah, ground source truth is always helpful. We see a lot of kind of misinformation that gets put out there, and so I think the update on kind of where it's at and where it's heading is really valuable. It feels a little bit like going back to our roots, because as we conceived this effort, we wanted something that we could dive into, as kind of a passion project or topic. And so, our first 10 episodes are on this specific topic, and I think putting something together in the works for a little bit of a check-in or a status update, with some players in the PAREA arena. But fun to see where it's going, where it's heading. And I mean, when this was first announced, this program, there were a number of potential providers that had kind of put their hat in the ring saying, hey, we're going to make this, we're going to do a program too. And I just have to give respect to any organization that's able to see something over the finish line. And now, I mean, I think rightfully so, they've been working out the bugs of how do we make it, financially successful in addition to academically successful for appraisers going through the program. And the Institute's had some work to do, but I think they've been doing that. And I'm encouraged to hear that it's trending towards, and there's the expectation that it should become, profitable. It's a new venture. It was a brand new thing to get off the ground from ground zero. And that they're still the only organization as of us recording today that has the program out there in place is a good thing. I'm encouraged to see that. And so we'll continue to get more of those entrants coming in. In one of our early episodes, Mark, we talked about appraisers, being concerned about this program because of a perceived tsunami of new appraisers that are going to come in and take all the work and do it real cheap and put them out of business. And, that's not been the case. We knew it wouldn't be, but it does provide an additional avenue to getting the certification. And we've talked on recent episodes that the appraiser community is very inelastic. It's not easy to get the credential to become an appraiser. And this is not watering that down. It's just providing another way to get the experience that you need that isn't who do you happen to know or can convince to take you on this multi-year journey with them of getting you the experience that you need to become certified. So really fun to see the update. I'm glad you're bringing it up.
You bet. And I am definitely proud of the Appraisal Institute in taking this on. Nobody else has gotten across the finish line. As you said, there's a lot of folks that started out believing they would, and they may still, but it's hard. I think this is a brand new thing. It's all encompassing. It is bringing a lot of education and testing and whatnot to a student who is going to finish the program if successful with the license. And, I think a long established organization like the Appraisal Institute just doesn't move or shift or create very well. I mean, no organization like that does. And I was certainly concerned that the Appraisal Institute wouldn't be able to do something like that. This is pretty bold, and gets a lot of questions, and it should. And I think it's the questioning, both internal and external, of the organization on PAREA are helping the iterations in finding the right place where this can be a mainstay in our industry. And I think that's I personally think that's a real legacy. I know there's many that disagree, but I do think that meeting future appraisers where they're at and helping them get in is a good thing.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. It's just opening another door, and we had talked about in the past, a recent episode, some of the pullback of DEI initiatives and what has unintentionally happened. And we've talked about this kind of at length in the prior episodes, is because you have to know somebody to get in. It's pretty well documented that the appraiser population hasn't been terribly diverse, and this providing an additional pathway that isn't just find a family member or somebody that you're personally connected to be able to get the experience, just opens the doors for anybody in the community who is passionate about, real estate and valuation. It gives a way in. It's far from a floodgate opening, but it's a way that naturally will lead to diversification without, trying to target a program that's only people that fit a certain makeup or character or whatever. It just makes it available to anybody who's interested, and so I'm excited to see it continue to roll forward. But it's just taking down a barrier without reducing, in my mind, the quality of the training that the appraiser gets as they work towards that licensing credential.
You bet. And in other Appraisal Institute news, I saw Paula send out a message just over the last day or two that they are beginning their permanent CEO search, which that's been a hot topic over the last 12 plus months, the least you could say. But they are doing that, so that'll be interesting to follow as that runs along.
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely.
Well, Jeff, the last thing I had on the list here was I labeled it on our show sheet here of Pulte rescissions. Bill Pulte has been anything but stagnant in his time as FHFA director. I'll just kind of list off or summarize the real three big actions. Of course, we have talked about expense reduction by way of layoffs, a return to work initiative. I think we covered the DEI is dead that also made its way into FHFA offices, but has undone a few things that FHFA has done over the last year or two. The first, terminating special purpose credit programs. These were Fannie and Freddie down payment and closing assistance for first-time homebuyers. So ending those programs, scrapping climate risk planning rules, remove the requirements for housing finance entities to plan for climate-related risk. As I was briefly skimming what that rule was that was rescinded, was that they were trying to not create a separate department, but sort of infiltrate this analysis into all their existing departments. A lot of that certainly made sense to me. I mean, we've got increasing natural disasters, all over and creating havoc on real estate all over the place. So I'm anxious to read more about it. But then also the rescission of advisory bulletin, it's 2024-06, which was eliminate guidance on unfair and deceptive acts or practices, compliance for regulated entities aligning with leaner FHFA focus. And Jeff, I think this turned on to something that we have to deal with, which is the reconsideration of value. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, it is. And in a previous episode, when they had announced kind of this new reconsideration of value ROV process, that was coming out. And if I have my facts correct, which is always suspect, I think it implemented in October 31st of last year. The Halloween date was maybe a little bit of a mental marker there. But, it's just interesting to see these applied, Mark, because I didn't have and don't have any concerns with that particular aspect in terms of putting structure around the reconsideration of value process that is available to borrowers to initiate the way that it was implemented and rolled out, towards the fall of last year. It seemed equitable. It seemed, like it it provided a pathway for those paying for a valuation service to to be able to provide data, and gave some requirements of those doing it. It wasn't just a blanket, well, I don't like the number that dropped out the bottom, so I'm going to complain and ask you for a different one. You had to have data and like a rationale behind it. So interesting to see that they've rescinded this, but I think this all speaks to the more narrow focus of FHFA. As you had kind of concluded there, a lot of these policies tend to be getting back to them being a regulator of safety and soundness for Fannie and Freddie. We've talked quite a bit, and there's still ongoing news about a release from Fannie and Freddie from conservatorship at some point down the road. And so these things that seem to be aimed at helping with housing affordability, or reconsiderations of value, or the climate aspects. I think FHFA is saying, hey, we're taking a more narrow view of what our role is and what the enterprises should be, focused on, which is liquidity in the housing market, and making sure that there's funds available to be purchased, but not necessarily, trying to augment or provide or support, like first-time homebuyer programs. You can argue whether that's, a good goal to be pursuing, but I think Bill Pulte is taking the position that it's not their narrowly defined focus, and so they're pulling these things back as a result.
Yeah, you bet. I definitely felt in 2023 and 2024 that there was potential for scope creep. I don't know if it really applies to the three rescission items we've summarized here. I think reconsideration of value process generally is protective for the appraiser. It can be burdensome as you're moving quickly, but talking about value, acknowledging that there can be different opinions of value, and why, kind of talking out through the report why those different opinions exist is, I think, helpful. Keeps appraisers out of courtrooms and being turned in and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's generally healthy. So maybe baby being thrown out with the bathwater to some degree, but we're here to watch a little further and see what comes of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that was definitely my sentiment as well. Is I don't think that in and of itself was a problem or needed to be thrown out, but we're observing what is actually happening, and that was one of the casualties along the way.
Well, Jeff, we're recording this on March 27th. It is opening day of Major League Baseball. As a Houston Astros fan, I am very excited for the Astros 3 p.m. First pitch. Baseball season is like full swing. We won our first 9U AAA tournament this last weekend, and play again this upcoming weekend. So it's been a lot going on, a lot of baseball, and that's always good times for me.
Well, it's fun. I know you've lived and breathed that. I was never coordinated enough to hit the ball with the bat. In fact, I have like these scarring memories of T-ball. Like I'd stand up to the plate, try to hit the ball, miss the ball, hit the tee. I felt so stupid, so embarrassed. I only lasted a year in that league, I think, before I moved on to other sports. Mark, I'm not as coordinated as you, obviously.
I don't know what it is, Jeff. I bet we could get you into baseball pretty quick. Maybe we'll do that on another episode.
All right, challenge accepted.
Very good. Well, episode 36, enjoyed it. Look forward to a variety of interviews, hoping to connect with a few more PAREA graduates here soon, and introduce names and faces of that great program to the world, and see what else we can get into.
Yeah, the world of our couple of viewers, Mark, is exciting, but looking forward to it. Those will be fun conversations to have. So stay tuned, and we'll be back whether you like it or not.
Take care.